This paper begins with an apology for selling itself under false pretences. In the misty past, when Simon asked us to suggest topics, I ambitiously claimed to tackle two subjects: the stones at St Vigeans churchyard and their relationship to all the stones in Angus. With a 25-minute guillotine in talk time and a hair's breadth in preparation time, I can't get further than the churchyard. In a conference with such a wide European perspective, this is an unashamedly local study, but most of my comparative evidence has to be drawn from out with Pictland. So in that sense, it puts Pictish art in a wider European perspective. The site of St Vigeans, near the coast of Angus by Arbroath, is dramatic and numinous. The narrow, steep mound has two streams flowing past its base, and it is located in a secret hidden fold of the hills. Such a location would invite ancient prehistoric and ritual activities, but there has been no excavation on the site, so pretty much everything that follows is guesswork and likely to be considerably modified if excavations ever took place. The site today reveals a serene medieval and 19th century church surrounded by silent Presbyterian graves. When the church was restored, and this is the range of stones that are available, when the church was restored in the 19th century, a large number of much earlier Pictish stones were recovered from the medieval fabric, and they are now splendidly displayed in Historic Scotland's nearby museum. I say splendid because Historic Scotland did it, rather than because I was involved in actually putting them there. My aim is to take these stones out of the museum and repopulate the hill, trying to work out what these stones were actually doing up there. A quick glance at the collection will reveal that the stones are very different from the serried ranks of Presbyterian gravestones which are up there now. Some were probably gravestones, but both their various shapes and iconography suggest that they serve many different functions. Simon Taylor has pointed out that the raison d'etre for this site is the cult of St Vigean. The place name tells us two things. The name refers to the Irish St Fechin, who died in 664, but the modification to its spelling indicates that his cult reached eastern Scotland when the Pictish language still prevailed, probably before the end of the 9th century. Moreover, using St Andrews as a parallel, this emphatic use of the saint's name for a place indicated the strong presence of the saint's relics. Thus, we might expect significant evidence for the cult of the saint, and this seems to be the case. The first historic record of the graveyard comes from William Dempster in 1627. Although his History of the Scottish Church has been described as one of the most discredited works ever written in the field of Scottish history, he nonetheless mentions a wooden cross in the churchyard which neither fire nor iron could destroy. That might suggest it's actually a stone cross, of which we have many. John Aitken, who wrote the statistical account of 1791, refers to a famous grave which was shown to visitors in the churchyard. By then, all taint of the Catholic past had been purged, and the grave was assigned to the architect who built Arbroath Abbey and St Vigeans Church. Chalmers, in 1848, produces a rather garbled account of what he saw in the churchyard and what he gleaned from the minister's memories. By the famous grave, there was a large-built cross, or rather two crosses, which stood about 7 feet from the south wall of the church and about a like distance from each other, and they were removed in the 1840s because they encumbered the ground. It is in approximately this position that the restoring minister William Duke had his own memorial erected in 1915. So that, to me, is the tingly spot around there, but it's been dug up for William Duke's grave. If we can accept that this persistent memory of the famous grave and cross, or crosses, placed outside the church, belonged to St Vigean, then we can start to look for parallels. In the Anglo-Saxon church, important relics were venerated within the church, sometimes brought into the crypt. In the Irish tradition, there was often a separate cult site out with the church. At Iona, Columba's relics were brought in from his humble grave, marked with a pillow stone, to the shrine chapel which stood outside the church, guarded by St John's Cross. At Fordoun, near to St Vigeans, there may have been a similar arrangement. Here, a small saint's chapel survives adjacent to the parish church. It was clearly a sacred destination by the time King Kenneth II is recorded visiting it in 970 to 995. The Fourteenth Chapel was substantially rebuilt in the later Middle Ages, reusing an ancient cut-marked stone. This is a reminder that although there is no mention of an enclosure at St Vigeans by the 18th century, some such structure might have been removed or fallen into disuse. As late as the 1840s, stones around the grave were being removed because they got in the way. It's intriguing that the first mention of St Vigeans Church in 1189 describes it as the church with the chapel. For comparison, Meagle is described in the 12th century as the church with the chapel beside it. If not a complete building, there could have been a wooden structure around the tomb, as Thomas has illustrated from München-Aubing. The Rites of Durham describe a similar wooden structure erected to protect Cuthbert's relics while the cathedral was being built in the late 11th century. It had a wooden palisade wall and a lead roof and was simply intended to cover the shrine. And I now have just gathered that at Forteviot, the graves were marked by 4 post holes at the corners, indicating perhaps some form of superstructure over them. Next, we are told that beside the grave was a great cross. The tiny stump of Vigeans number 9 was one of the 2 crosses seen by Chalmers at the gravesite. This would echo the arrangement at Iona of a great cross beside the tomb. The other cross by the grave was number 7, but this had already been cut about and indented for other purposes, so it was not necessarily in its original location. But number 29 is the sliced up remains of the shrine itself, reused in the 17th century as a lintel. In its present condition, it's hard to imagine how it functioned, but other examples present a range of possibilities. St Leonard's shrine at St Andrews is the nearest parallel, and this appears to be simply a solid tomb cover found in an area of stone kists. The header stone at Peterborough, on the other hand, has deep holes for the insertion of brandia. John Crook has discovered a very good parallel at Waillé-des-Champs, where the tomb cover sits on a raised plinth and has a pouring hole at its side, which would explain how this kind of solid tomb could at the same time allow substance to touch it. However, activities at Clones provide other possibilities. Although this is considered to be a Romanesque monument, it reflects much earlier designs of a metalwork shrine with its paddle finials and skeuomorph metal clasps. Its west face is blank, suggesting it abutted a structure like the cross at Kilfenora, where you can see at the base there's a house-shaped space available. Both monumental cross and tomb are found in close proximity at St Vigeans. A solid tomb cover placed on the ground might offer protection from thieves, but was less effective if the aim was to preserve precious relics beneath the soil outside. Hence the suggestion made previously that there was some shelter over the shrine. At Illanlochen, within the walled monastic precinct, the 8th century stone gable shrine is situated just south of the church, similar position to us. The substantial stone plinth would help to keep relics dry, and moreover, the sandy hilltop at St Vigeans is notably free draining. 19th century records at Clones indicate that the presence of the monumental stone tomb did not mean that the relics were locked away forever, quite on the contrary. At Clones, there was a huge stone kist beneath the cover, and year after year, 2 families would remove the stone and place their dead in the tomb until decomposed, removing the bones to make way for the next body. This activity is significant because it shows that a heavy lid, like the St Vigeans house shrine, could be removed if the relics were required for processions. Moreover, with the shrine outside the main body of the church, it would be suitable for Anturas, the Irish custom of processing around a circuit of sacred spots in the vicinity. The St Vigeans shrine is made from some specially selected and excellent stone, quarried at Forfar, about 12 miles away. Access to the quarry and the capacity to transport the stone over land suggests a powerful patron. This power is further indicated by other stones, presumably commissioned in the same batch as the shrine, coming from the same quarry. The recumbent, number 8, is made of the same stone. All the recumbents have a recessed panel on the upper face. This, together with the slot at one end, suggests they were not suitable to locate out in the rain, whereas perhaps the shrine with its pitched roof could manage better if exposed to the elements. So, I'm assuming that these recumbents were intended to be kept indoors, in the church itself or in a mortuary chapel. The arrangement for their carving down one side only indicates their potential location. And in this case, number 8 was perhaps originally alone in a place of prestige on the south side because of the position of its carving, as you can see there. Whereas number 13 and number 14, with different geology, not from the Great Quarry at Forfar, would be along the north wall. They're carving along another side. Here you go, the two others. A distinctive feature of the recumbent tombs in general is their lack of symbols, even though they are clearly made to honour individuals. They have the customary slots at the head end, receptacles for objects which have never been identified. At the same time at St Vigeans, there are 3 small symbol stones whose dimensions could make them suitable for such slots. They appear to be narrow, delicate and freestanding, potentially all suitable to fit into a composite object where their delicacy would not be at a disadvantage. So this is number 6, with, which seems to be freestanding arm of a cross with symbols on one side and interlace on the other. And these are 2 other small, slim fragments which potentially are of similar dimensions. They would thus explain 2 problems if they fitted into these slots. Why the recumbents have no identity markers, and why, although crosses generally avoid symbols within their body, these symbols are totally embedded within the cross because they are representing a person. The geology of these symbol fragments does not match up with any of the recumbent monuments that they potentially might pair, but this could be due to practical factors, such as the required depth of bedding planes for the tomb covers, which has to be pretty deep, and then, equally, the very fine graining for the small, delicately carved symbol stones. Another stone potentially in or near the church is the unique number 16. This is in some ways rightly compared with the pillar cross from Ray in Sutherland, which you can see here. Both share a somewhat chaotic key pattern on a pillar form. They are the same size, about 1 metre high and about 280 millimetres square. The pillar at Ray, however, is further ornamented with cows, stag, hound, interlace and spirals on the other faces. And Stevenson tentatively identifies this as a new art form, which he calls the pillar cross. The St Vigeans cross is much more sophisticated, having a 3-dimensional relief cross on each face, a cross-shaped section and a tenon for fitting into a plinth which would potentially raise it up higher. Its design suggests religious activity and focus taking place on all 4 sides, which originally led me to think it was some type of marker on a processional circuit where you'd walk all the way around it. But its 4-square shape and size bears some resemblance to a Roman altar. Thomas observes that if any kind of legacy from Roman times could be considered, it would be the most simple form of table altar with a single leg or prop, like a small pedestal table. He quotes the description of the altar of St Bridget's at Kildare by Cogitosus, which seems to imply a design based on the single stem of a tree. We know very little about the appearance of Pictish altars, and this one could probably function like the rusticus altar at Narbonne. In addition, St Anthony and Paul at Kilnarowane appear to be partaking of their holy bread above a single-leg table, rather similar to the rusticus altar and not a million miles different from this stone at St Vigeans. Thomas O'Carrigan describes types of outdoor altar in Ireland at Inishmurray. Protected by an enclosure, they permit celebrants and congregation to gather on all sides of the altar, and here there was an example of a post hole in the middle for a wooden, presumably, altar object. And this kind of practice of a congregation gathering the whole way around the altar would suit the carving of St Vigeans number 16 on all faces. We know very little about the design of Pictish altars, but this one of this size would perhaps be more suited to outdoor activities rather than the main altar of a chancel. All these stones discussed so far are directly connected with the church, and given the restricted nature of the site, were probably on the top of the mound. We now turn to look at the other types of stone which do not necessarily have to be adjacent to the church itself and may serve many functions apart from grave markers. The most dramatic is Drosten stone, with its inscription commemorating the three individuals, Drosten, Uret and Phocas. It is made of the same superior stone as the house shrine and premier recumbent. It is tempting, therefore, to see it as part of a single suite from one patron, a shrine for the relics, a tomb for the patron, and Drosten stone, not a grave marker, but for three people, but not a grave marker for three people, but a commemorative beacon for three individuals connected with establishing St Vigean at this location. Its iconography combines the power of the cross to ward off evil and secular power of lordship and the hunt. Early descriptions of its location are problematic. Its head ended up in the eastern gable, and I don't propose to examine its possible peregrinations here. Suffice to say that the first time it's recorded properly, it is comfortably located on an appropriate base, which seems to be original, now lost, near the entrance to the churchyard on the southeast side. Its iconography proclaims identity and ownership rather than any complex theology or liturgy. It therefore corresponds to the arrangement at Meagle, where two of the greatest slabs flank the entrance. The fourth stone brought from the distant quarry of Forfar is far less monumental and is carved with less conviction. It is a small cross with a solid ring head. Apart from its geology, it has no obvious reason to be associated with the other three premier stones. It could be simply a freestanding grave marker, but at St Vigeans, grave markers tend to be slabs, and any early freestanding cross in East Scotland is relatively unusual. One possibility is that it is a sanctuary marker, because elsewhere St Vigean is associated with sanctuary. At his home church of Fore in Ireland, it was declared that Fechin should forever have free sanctuary, while another of his Irish foundations is called Terman Fechin in recognition of its sanctuary. In Scotland, another Fechin church, Lesmahagow, means Fechin's enclosure. Here there were originally 4 sanctuary crosses, of which one survives. Here the right of sanctuary was confirmed by King David in 1144. At another of his Scottish churches, at Torfichan, there is one stone in the churchyard marking the centre of the sanctuary, while there are originally 4 more about a mile away at the points of the compass. The 12th century St Andrew's foundation legend recounts the arrival of St Andrew's relics at Kilrimond. During the ceremony, King Angus and Bishop Regulus perambulated the site holding the relics 7 times around, and the very place itself was defined by a visible mark. A ceremony like this could thus associate the cross, this little crosshead, with the shrine and the founders' monuments, all being celebrated at the time of the introduction of the relics. Another cross slab may be connected with perambulations and mark an important liturgical station within the churchyard. I've argued elsewhere that number 11 depicts the Trinity at the top, 2 and a little feet above them, and the 2 walkers approaching one another following a circuit. Luke 11, which combines concepts of the Trinity and walkers, is the key text for Rogation Day, a festival where the whole congregation circulates through the fields to pray for God's mercy on the crops. I would suggest this is not a memorial stone for 2 hooded walkers, but a significant station, perhaps the starting point for the Rogation Tide circuit. There are 2 clusters of knife marks across the hearts of the 2 seated figures, who I believe are God the Father and the Son. They are not convincingly the destructive marks of an iconoclast. This stone was anyway hidden by the time of the Reformation. Neither are they evidence of sharpening a knife. On the contrary, these marks would seriously blunt a blade. A 12th century Irish tale recounts warriors drawing their blades on a special stone at Samhain, and it says, "On that rock was the best token of peace that existed in England and Scotland." These marks are therefore more likely to represent the blunting of weapons on the heart of God as a token of peace. Given that this stone relates to rogation and perambulations of the land, the marks might relate to the end of a territorial dispute. And in fact, we have at Lindisfarne a very nice example of a territorial gift sealed with a broken knife, which is written in paper, just what I think that stone marks on the stone. I still have to tick the box of power and politics in order to justify my topic at this session. This will involve stone number 7, which is a masterpiece of carving, once the greatest stone on the site. I regard this as a preaching cross with a very polemical agenda, which would require careful priestly exegesis to instruct the viewer. As such, it would need to stand on level ground where a crowd could assemble, and indeed its earliest recorded site is partly buried at the top beside the famous grave. It consists of a magnificent and complex interlaced cross, flanked by 4 scenes, which are both polemical and create a severe dialectic. 2 scenes depict an orthodox and approved Christian behaviour, particularly concerning the priesthood. The other scenes are savage examples of false priests. None of the stories come from the Bible, but were evidently of current concern to the locality when the stone was made. We see the holy behaviours of Paul and Antony at the moment of the confraction of the host, matched by 2 dignified processing priests approaching the cross, with notably fine petra in tonsure and carrying tapers. They are diametrically opposed to bad practice, the fall of Simon Magus above the processing priests with his evil tonsure, and on the opposite him, the priest who is clearly performing the Tarabolium, a hideous Roman sacrifice carried out in honour of Cybele and described with enthusiastic detail by Prudentius. These images are not just anti-pagan, but are specifically against a pagan priesthood. The sermon being preached here is advocating the true Christian priesthood in contrast to the false pagan priests and their ancient practices. The cult of bull sacrifice in particular was hard to extirpate in Scotland, with reference to its continuation as late as the 18th century in churches. At both Fowlis Wester and Easey, one can see solemn processions of the aristocracy and their followers engaged in bull ceremonies, and we saw that the premier grave at Hallow Hill was filled with bovine teeth. The back of St Vigeans number 7 is full of secular endorsements in the form of almost obliterated symbols and aristocratic huntsmen, but one may be seeing here a statement about differing factions within the district, one power group supporting the church and the other persisting in their pagan practices, in particular led by some pagan priestly authority. There may be some evidence for this conservatism in the archaeological record. Not far from St Vigeans, along the natural boundary of the district, are a number of burial sites along the Lunan Water. Long-kist and barrow burials persist almost through most of the first millennium in this area and are therefore not specific indicators of religious affiliation. Moreover, the drive to gather souls of the secular departed to the confines of the churchyard was only gathering momentum in the 9th and 10th centuries. But what we see along the Lunan Water is a communal investment in burial among the ancestors, and presumably also invoking the power of the dead to protect and define the territory, because it's on this boundary. One of these sites stands out, Redcastle, at the mouth of the river on a prominent bluff, whose profile, perhaps by coincidence, mirrors that of St Vigeans, which is also Aber-Brothock, the mouth of the river Brothock, just down the way. This site was in use at Redcastle for about 700 years, from the early 4th century to the late 9th century, but during that whole epoch, only about 20 people were buried here. 5 of these elite graves were elaborately constructed with ditches and specially placed beach stones. An elite such as this, in active use when an elite site such as this, in active use when St Vigeans was being created, indicated the persistence of ancient social customs and beliefs, which had persisted from long before the Christian era. The social organisation required to prepare these graves, and specifically to officiate over the burial rites, was far older than the Christian presence at St Vigean. It was perhaps against a powerful but conservative element in society led by wizards or magi like Simon Magus, clinging to the old ways that the priest of St Vigeans designed number 7. I've only mentioned a few stones in the St Vigeans collection, and the others can tell many more stories. The museum context tends to neutralise the power and function of this sculpture, reducing the stones to homogeneous art objects. Considerable imagination is thus required to visualise the hill before the church was rebuilt in the 12th century and the old sculpture was reduced to building blocks. However, using every tool available, from comparative sites, geology, iconography, liturgy, it's possible to envisage a dynamic area of ardent missionary activity, fueled by the cult of an imported Irish saint and some powerful patrons.